Greetings. I'm Jim Cain. I'm a solution architect at Jacquette Consulting, and this project that we're going to talk about was basically my baby for 2.5 years. So, standing the test of time, I thought it was an appropriate title. As Chandy mentioned, this was something that got started in 2007, went through several iterations, and was in full flight in the summer of 2009. So, speaking to some of the effort that you were questioning earlier, it does take effort. It takes a strong commitment from leadership and executive teams in the organization. So I just wanted to present what we did. Given the time frame, everything's a bit of a high level, and given our audience, everything is focused more on DITA and Typefi. But there are many parts to it. I've had my hands in every part of it, I think. So certainly I can dive into the weeds outside of this presentation if anybody so desires. So, just a quick rundown of what we're going to cover. Our client was the Institutes, still is one of our clients. We'll cover their history and what they were doing before DITA and Typefi, what drove their change. Then we'll talk about how they're using DITA, how they're using Typefi, what it has all meant for them as an organization, the growth that they've realized, and then some discussion at the end about what we saw as keys to success for this project. So who are the Institutes? The Institutes, they're a nonprofit organization. They provide educational services for risk management and insurance, primarily to the insurance industry, but also outside of that particular industry since they have expertise in risk management overall. They provide both print and online course material, textbooks, course guides, other type of print publications, and they deliver their courses through a learning management system. All right, so before DITA and Typefi, what were they doing? They were obviously print-centric. As they termed it when we started this analysis sessions with them, the book is king, right? So they had a textbook that was the primary educational product. Along with that, they had 2 supplemental publications which drew off of different content. So they have a thing they call course guides, which is basically practice questions as a companion with the textbook. Another element to their organization is exams to achieve designation. So they use their students use these materials to prepare themselves for taking exams to achieve various designations that their organization offers. Other supplemental publications that they wrote content for were something they called key points. I like to call them the cliff notes of their textbook. And then they also had a product, they still have a flashcard product for all their glossary terms, right? So what could they do before in this current process? They could, at best, create or revise 4 courses in a given year, right? Very, very lengthy process, very manual, very tedious. So since they were very print-centric, their content was originally written 1 chapter at a time. So you'd have a subject matter expert painstakingly author a single chapter at a time. Maybe you had a couple SMEs authoring content for the same course. Not likely. They usually had a SME per course. Author it in Word. When they're done with it, with the chapter, it goes through a severe editorial process. And once it's considered done and approved, it would get thrown over the wall to the products department to pull into Adobe InDesign. They were an InDesign shop from the beginning, and they did all their manual layout of their Word content into InDesign. They did that chapter by chapter for a course. They did it for the textbook. They did it for the course guide. They did it for the review notes. They did automate their own flashcards. They just had some kind of script that pulled out all the keywords that were found in their textbook product and merged it into another InDesign template for their flashcards. That was the only automation that they had. And then this production team that created all their print publications is very small, maybe 5 people at best. And that's important, and I'll come back to that later. All right, so at the time, they had started dabbling in online learning. They saw how painful it was because they were print-centric. They created their print products first. Online was an afterthought, right? So they would go through the same amount of effort once they had their textbook done to create the online product that they wanted for their LMS, right? So it was wait for the textbook to be done, and then their team would transition over and start working on online modules, right? So if you can imagine, they were authoring their content a chapter at a time. That certainly doesn't translate to an online module where you got to think about cognitive load for your students as they're consuming content online. So that meant a lot of manual effort going through chapter by chapter to pull out the individual topics that they wanted to ultimately produce for online. So that was why the effort was basically duplicated, because these folks had to go through and pick out all these pieces and hand cobble online modules for their LMS. So perhaps you can feel their pain, right? It's a lot of work. And that harkens back to they could accomplish 3 to 4 products a year. So at a high level, what were their requirements? They knew they're an educational company, just like Kaplan, right? So they wanted to have their content to be written in a much more granular way. So for them, it was the learning object, right? So they wanted to be able to have their authors write their educational content, learning object by learning object, and any supporting content to go along with that, and then be able to reuse any learning object across any course. Then from that content, once they would have it, they wanted to be able to automatically lay out the InDesign textbook, the InDesign course guide, the InDesign review notes, their flashcards. They still wanted to keep those publications. And then they also wanted to automate their online learning modules. They didn't want to have to hand cobble these things anymore. And then along with that, we're making their content more granular, right? So I mentioned they have three print publications: the textbook, the course guide, the review notes. Those are all different pieces of content. So for them, a learning object is really 3 pieces of distinct content. So now for them, they're taking their authoring process, which is a chapter at a time, and now we're just blowing that up, right? So we're turning everything into topic-based authoring. So if a textbook ultimately had 50 learning objects in it, that's now, instead of 10 chapters, they're writing 50 LOs for the textbook. Then they have to write 50 assessments for their course guide. They have to write 50 key points for their review notes. So being able to manage those content development process for those many pieces of content, they knew from the beginning that they needed to have some kind of workflow to help them with that. All right, so where did we go? So we're basically focusing on the first 2 requirements for this session, right? So it's making content more granular and reusable. That's where DITA comes in. And their second requirement was automating their print publishing. That's where Typefi comes in. So I'm distilling all of this onto one slide, right? Making content granular and using DITA. So very early on in this process, we had to take all their business requirements, figure out how to do this, right? So we had authoring we had to consider. We had content management to consider, where we need to store all this content somewhere. We had print publishing to consider. We had online publishing to consider, and as I just spoke to briefly, workflows, right? We needed to be able to manage all this content development. So we went through rounds of analysis for the different components that they needed, right? So on the authoring side, it was, okay, how do we author content at a more granular level? What tools do we need to use? So we knew we wanted to go XML. We had to review various things. Do we just do our own custom XML? Do we find something that's generally available? And that's where DITA came out, right? So A, DITA was XML. B, DITA was topic-based authoring, hence the learning objects for the institutes. That's why we chose that. It's open source, huge following, very active open source community. So we saw that as a very minimal risk to choose DITA. So for them, our learning objects are DITA, and we did do some specializations for them. Specifically at that time, we're talking 2007 folks, so the learning specialization was just a demo at that point in time. So we basically used the learning specialization demo in 2007 and extended it through DITA's specializations capability. So now we've got all these little pieces of content, right? We've got the main content that go into the textbook for the learning object. They also have digital assets. They also have glossary terms, right? So we treated everything as its own topic. So then we had to be able to reference, we've got a learning object content for the textbook ultimately. We need to be able to pull in digital assets. We need to be able to pull in the glossary terms they want to associate with that particular learning object. So we made heavy use of DITA constructs that already existed. So XREFs, content references, those were all used to be able to link together digital assets and glossary terms into a learning object. How do we pull it all together? So remember, the book was king, so we still needed to be able to produce textbooks and the other corresponding publications. So we still had to have a notion of a chapter. And then, so we used the DITA maps construct that are already built into DITA to assemble our learning objects into those chapters. They call them assignments now. The Institute does. And then ultimately, we have to be able to pull in all those chapters to be able to create the textbook and the other print publications. That's where the DITA book map comes in. Another construct out of the box with DITA, so we don't have to worry about building all these things. So as we start from top down, we're now authoring topics of very granular pieces of content for the institutes. It's to address a specific educational objective. And we're also, all the supplemental topics, digital assets, glossary terms, are also written in DITA. They're also stored in our same central repository for content along with the learning objects as their own files, if you want to think of them as files. And piece it all together. That's where XREFs, ConRefs, pull them together, maps and book maps, aggregate your entire product out of your individual learning objects. So because we're using these mechanisms, any of these topics can be reused anywhere, across each other, and across products. I did add a note here. Ultimately, we're storing XML. If you can imagine the change that this was on the organization to go from writing chapters at a time to writing all these topics, that was a big enough change for the organization to go through. To throw them into like an XML tool right away, that wasn't going to happen, right? So their subject matter experts they still author manuscripts for their learning object content, and they do it in Word. And then what we do is, and they go through their own electronic workflow, through an approval process. So your author and your substantive editors are all working in Word. That's what they were familiar with. And once approved, then there's an automated conversion to the DITA XML. And then that's where the production team and products takes over. They use XMetal Author is what they use to make any minor edits to content once it's approved. And they use XMetal to do all this XREF, content ref, and building of their maps. So all of that for one slide. All right, so what's next? Print publishing. Just like the authoring, we knew we had a print publishing component that we needed. We also went through a similar analysis for what tool do we want to use to accomplish automated print publishing. Do we just do straight up XSL from our DITA OT to try to get to PDF? That wasn't going to happen, right? That was just very ugly, nothing very fine, right? There were a couple other tools we looked at that could generate pretty publications, but you couldn't really edit it very well without having to go back all the way through the transform. They were already in InDesign shop. They had templates already in design for all of their print publications. And when we looked at Typefi, it was like, well, this is a no-brainer, right? They're InDesign based. You You can kick off workflows on Typefi with their CXML. It seems like a natural fit. So that's the tool we ended up choosing. So we worked closely with Typefi. I call it professional services here. At the time, it was Caleb. And he was awesome. Caleb was awesome to work with, obviously. So what did they do for us? So for the institutes, I mentioned they had InDesign templates already for each of their print publications. Caleb was able to basically preserve those templates. He used those as a starting point, and he just converted them into the templates that are needed for Typefi to automate all the layout that was necessary. Big win for the client. They also created and configured all of the jobs for each print publication that the institutes required. And Caleb also advised us on Typefi CXML so that we could create the necessary transforms from all the DITA XML that we had into the CXML that Typefi needed to kick off a job. Now, when I put a little asterisk next to jobs, because back in the day they were called jobs, they're called workflows now, but they'll always be jobs to me. So, all right. So then we took all that. Caleb was on campus a lot with us, sitting through meetings with products folks, working through how to get those InDesign templates typified, for lack of a better term. Made a lot of great recommendations along the way. And then we used the CXML that Caleb was ultimately coming up with for their InDesign templates. They were kind of like our golden rule, right? So that greatly helped us when we had to transform DITA into the CXML, because we had a clear target for what we needed to output. So what we did is we integrated the Institute's CMS with DITA and Typefi, and in the end, we have fully automated the conversion of DITA book maps from their source repository with Typefi to get to full InDesign print publications, right? So the artifact that comes out of that, yeah, we can get a PDF out of Typefi. We also get the InDesign document. So there's a level of completeness that you get in this workflow. Maybe we're 90% all the way, right? There might be some tweaks that need to be made, not to content, but there might be some layout tweaks that they might want to make, but they can do that. So that resulting InDesign document for a given publication flows back into our CMS. It's available as its own file. If somebody in products needs to make a tweak to how something laid out, they can, right? If they need to make a tweak to content, they go back to the XML, and we just rerun the job, and a new InDesign document gets created. All of this takes very little time as compared to what they used to do manually, right? So from here, so in the end, as of today, they have over 8,000 learning objects. Remember, there's 3 pieces to a learning object, so in reality, that means 24,000 files are out in our central repository that feed the same 3 print publications that they used to have as well. And then there are many more digital assets, many more glossary terms sitting out there in the repository wilderness, and all of these things can be reused. In the content management system, we had to come up with multiple electronic workflows to help them streamline and manage all their content development processes. Products builds 1 book map per course. From that 1 book map, remember the book map aggregates all your chapters. The chapters aggregate all the LOs that go into each chapter. The LOs aggregate all the content that are needed per educational objective. 1 book map ties it all together. And from that 1 book map for a course, we can generate all the print publications that they need, right? Depending on what they choose, it goes through a slightly different transform so that we kick off the right job, use the right InDesign template, but 1 map gets you all your publications. That same map, remember they also do online learning, that same map produces all the online learning modules automatically that get fed into their learning management system. Believe it or not, this is a conservative number, right? So they actually Like I said, they could do 3, maybe 4 products in a given year. I've seen years since where they've had over 150 products come out the door in a given year. So that 1,900% that's a conservative number. And ultimately, we have everything in XML, it's DITA topics. The business has the flexibility to change as they need to change now, and they have changed. Back in 2009, their online learning modules were Flash-based. Flash has gone away, right? So HTML5. We jumped back in about 2014, killed off their Flash modules and gave them HTML5 modules. Now we're going through a second iteration. As recently as 2 weeks ago, we've finished the next iteration of their HTML5 modules because they want to change the look and feel and add in a few more components for their online learning. Paul Illian is their director of products. He's been looking at changing up the InDesign templates for the first time after all these years. But using the same structure, just making it look a little different, have a little different look and feel to it. All right, so I'd be amiss to not walk through some keys to success. This was a large undertaking. This organization, they didn't have a great future if they were going to stay print-centric. And as an educational provider, they had already knew that they needed to go to online learning. They dabbled in it. They realized how much effort it was taking them to maintain both print and online. They realized that they needed to turn their organization upside down how they did business, right? So this was a large project for them. It had support from the top. The top was driving it. They knew they needed to make this change. They knew they needed to get everybody on board, and they needed help to get them started and walk them through everything. So project structure was key. It wasn't just a Jacquette team working with folks like Typefi to do this. It was a huge team effort. You know, we obviously had a core team from the business. You know, we worked with them on a day-to-day basis, met with the whole core team on a weekly basis throughout this entire project, just keeping things on track. And the core team was made up of key stakeholders from every department involved. So we had folks from subject matter experts, we had folks from products, we had folks from editorial, folks from assessments. You know, everybody had input and visibility in this project on the business side. And if any conflicts came up, it was their job to prioritize which things got done and which things didn't make the cut. Above the core team, we also had what we called like an executive leadership team, right? So those folks we also met with at least weekly, if not bi-weekly, and the CEO himself is involved on a monthly basis, right? He's the guy paying the bills for this. We met with him on a monthly basis to show him where we were and give him progress. And if the core team or the executive team couldn't resolve any conflicts, you know, he was the guy that could do that on a monthly basis for us. Work closely with the business to refine requirements. I mentioned already, we worked on a daily basis with working teams just to churn through all the requirements. Several components to this: authoring, editing, how to achieve print publishing, how to achieve online publishing, managing all this content within a central repository. There's a lot to go through. And we didn't want to work behind closed doors, meet with them again and hope that we got it right. We wanted to be, you know, with them every day just to make sure that we're on the right track. Not every day, but multiple times a week. Finding the best technologies to integrate, right? With a system as large as this, you got so many components that are involved. During our analysis travels, I saw several all-in-one solutions, right? Your all-in-one central repository with its own authoring tool, with its own publishing side to it, even ones that had their own LMS. That's all well and good, but you know, in the end, I want the best components to do each job the right way, as opposed to having this all-in-one solution that does things okay across the board, but can't hit every requirement that the business needs. Obviously, agile development process, 2007, we were doing it, right? So that harkens back to my notes about project structure, right? So we were meeting with the folks multiple times a week, core team every week, executive team every week, the CEO himself every month, right? We needed to be able to churn out results and get things in front of the business quickly and frequently so that we could verify our requirements and continuously make sure that we're going on the right path. And also give the business that opportunity very early in the process, all along the way, to make changes, right? Because as they think about things and have these requirements, and we start showing them stuff, then that triggers their heads to, okay, maybe that's not the right way to think about it, maybe we need to go this direction. Then it's much easier to make those changes all along the way than to wait, one milestone at a time and then realize, oh, we need to undo all these things to now go this different direction. And I've already kind of alluded to it as far as how frequently we were working with the business. Communication is key. All right, so that was a lot. Any questions? All right. Cool. Thanks.